When The Jungle was published in 1906, an astonished nation was disgusted by the revolting detail Upton Sinclair used in order to expose the truth about the meatpacking industry. The public of America were informed that their meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. It was also possible to find human flesh mixed with the meat that was shipped to hundreds of buyers. The workers consisted of low class and mostly foreign, hanging always on the verge of starvation and dependent for its opportunities of life. The working conditions were unbelievable. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, so you could only imagine how filthy their hands were once coming into contact with the food that was going out to their consumers. Sinclair caused everyone who read his book to reflect on the way their health was being used and the disregard of workers' rights. On March 25, 1911, we were shown just how horribly workers' rights were being violated. The working conditions at the time were not nearly up to par with what should have been provided. The fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was one of the first events to shed light on the sickening working conditions of American laborers. Specific to this event was the rights of the female labor force in the United States because of the predominant number of women working at the factory. 141 young men and women died as a result of this fire. At least 125 of them were women between the ages of 16 and 23. Scraps of cloth inside the factory caught fire and burnt the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the factory. The employees could not leave the factory because there was only one interior fire escape. The women and men were forced to burn or jump out of the windows to their deaths. The next morning, more than 15,000 shirtwaist makers in New York walked out. They demanded a 20% pay raise, a 52-hour work week, and extra pay for overtime. The local labor unions and Women's Trade Union League knew they needed to take responsibility for their laborers, and so they did, getting more than 70% of smaller factories to agree to their terms within the next 2 days after strikes. Minimum wage laws were not always present like they are today. The United States was not the first to instill minimum wage laws either, but in 1912, Massachusetts was the first state to create a minimum wage legislation in the United States. Prior to this, Massachusetts established a minimum wage commission in 1911 and started to publish bulletins in January of 1914. Some of the first bulletins to ever come from them were wages of women in the brush factories in Massachusetts and wages of women in the corset factories in Massachusetts. These bulletins were initially directed towards the rights of women and children who worked in the labor industry. It was directed towards women and children since at the time they were currently the majority working in industries. Within these bulletins, it was stated that women and children had the right to receive proper payment for their labor, and it was the responsibility for the employers to pay them. Lawrence, Massachusetts was one of the most prominent textile manufacturing towns in the United States. The American Woolen Company in Massachusetts employed around 40,000 people, which consisted of mainly women between the ages of 14 and 18. The workers lived in small, hazardous tenement buildings, living on only bread, beans, and molasses. In January of 1912, the American Woolen Company lowered its wages, causing a major uprising. Numerous amounts of strikers demanded for bread and roses. They requested bread as a demand for livable wages, and roses was used as a connotation meaning for respect. The industrial workers of the world, or Wobblies, then took control by organizing the strike for many women and children. On March 12, 3 months after the strikers walked out, the American Woolen Company surrendered, giving the strikers an increase in wages, overtime pay, and rules about discrimination. This was the first time that large numbers of unskilled immigrant workers came together under the leadership of the Wobblies. Although the mill owners took no consideration for the working conditions they had their workers under and their rights, that did not stop the many brave women who were not going to go down without a fight. Mexican and Mexican-American cotton pickers in San Joaquin Valley, California, knew they could not continue to work picking cotton if they were paid minuscule amounts of money and were forced to fight through killer living conditions. An article was written on just how these farmers approached the situation. The pickers demanded their higher wages at $1 per 100 pounds of cotton picked. When they did not get exactly what they wanted, they went on strike. Nearly 10,000 pickers were gathered with picket signs demanding exactly what they wanted. Shortly after, the growers notified the pickers that they would not allow any more public meetings. The strikers became violent, and the growers even threatened the town of Tulare that they would pack up their business and find another town that supported their cotton picking endeavors. It was found that the growers would pay the pickers 75 cents per 100 pounds picked so the strikers would fight for this, and they would appeal to authorities to protect their rights under state and federal laws. These pickers were not going to be let out to suffer. They knew the government needed to do something to protect their interests. 2 years later, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, was passed to protect the rights of laborers, like the pickers in the San Joaquin Valley, to bargain collectively. Just a little more than a month before the Wagner Act passed, the Supreme Court ruled the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional, suggesting that federal efforts to legislate wages, prices, and working conditions was invalid. This, in a way, relieved the government from the responsibility of creating better working conditions for laborers. The government then made itself responsible for protecting the rights of laborers to bargain collectively to improve their own working conditions through different union activities. Senator Robert F. Wagner authored this New Deal Act for just those reasons. In order to enforce the fair protection of laborer rights, the Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB would attribute deadlock between the laborers and employers, guarantee fair and democratic union elections, and ensure fair labor practices would not go unpunished. The Wagner Act single-handedly created a surge in labor union membership that would finally allow laborers to safely organize for better working and living conditions. The most evident change in the labor union membership came from females. From the beginning of the 1930s to the end, women membership in labor unions nearly tripled. Laborers were now able to take responsibility for the protection of their own rights without having to worry about being punished by their employer. The Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, also known as the Taft-Hartley Act, was a major setback for labor unions. This law was sponsored by Senator Robert Taft and Representative Fred A. Hartley, Jr., and came into law even though President Truman vetoed it. Although Truman vetoed this law, he used it several times throughout his presidency. The Taft-Hartley Act was an amendment to the Wagner Act, but was the complete opposite. This federal law restricted activities and the power of labor unions. It addressed issues like jurisdictional strikes, federal jurisdiction, and several other issues. The effects of this law were later seen in 2002 when President Bush had intervened in a shutdown of 29 West Coast ports that had lasted 11 days. President Bush was able to do this since the Taft-Hartley Act emergency provision states, if in the President's opinion the shutdown is harming the entire industry or putting at risk the nation's health or safety, he may appoint a board of inquiry to inform him about issues involved in the dispute and to make a written report to him. He can then direct the Attorney General to petition any district court in order to end it. By doing so, he was able to show an example of how the Taft-Hartley Act had weakened the Wagner Act. A major event in 1955 was when the AFL and CIO merged. Both of them were big labor groups with very different ideas about how to spread the labor movement and promote workers' rights. The AFL and the CIO were rivals for 20 years. However, by the 1950s, the groups realized it was their responsibility to unite in order to be as stronger and more effective as a single organization. Labor unions are still very much a necessity to protect workers' rights and safety. Not too long ago, in January of 2004, Walmart was caught in a humongous scandal. Walmart would have night lock-ins where no person could get into or out of the store during non-business hours if there was not a manager present. The dangers presented here are almost as bad as those presented in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. Workers said they could not get out in case of any personal emergency, even if someone had broken their leg or if someone were dying of an asthma attack. The emergency exit was hardly an option because the employees had been notified if they were to use it for anything other than a fire, they would be fired immediately. Again in November 2013, Walmart was under fire because they were firing employees over strikes and protests. When employees planned to strike for Black Friday, they were threatened to be fired. The National Labor Relations Board took responsibility and said it would file a report for the violation of workers' rights, but instead it allowed the corporation and its employees to work out an agreement. As one can see, the products of the Wagner Act are still evident today, protecting the rights of laborers to organize for the protection of their own rights. The Wagner Act created responsibilities of workers, government, and employees, which revolutionized the way the U.S. labor relations would be structured forever.
What do you know about the Wagner Act?
It established a federal agency, the NLRB.
And from that, how do you think it has affected the relations between labor and employer in the United States?
It gave leverage to the laborer by empowering them to seek better working conditions.
Is the government wrong for trying to mediate issues between labor and employer?
No, sometimes it is necessary to have a neutral party.
As a small business owner, how would you react to your employees organizing against you?
I would hear them out and weigh my options between their demands and the future of my business.